On a gray November morning off the coast of Iceland, three fishing brothers, Jon, Sigurd, and Eric, hauled their nets from waters so cold they froze to bare hands in seconds. The catch was meager that season. Stocks had dwindled, rivals had moved south, and the family's boat, the Hrafen, groaned under the strain of repairs and debt. Then the net snagged something heavy, something that didn't move like fish or kelp. What emerged from the dark water was bronze, ancient, crusted with barnacles and corroded green. A bell, no larger than a man's fist, covered in symbols that looked like runes. Not the runes carved into modern Icelandic monuments, but older ones, worn and deliberate. The brothers stood dripping on deck, staring at the object as if it might vanish. Jon, the eldest and most superstitious, whispered that such things didn't surface by accident. Sigurd, the pragmatist, saw immediately that it could be sold. But Eric, the youngest, and the one who loved history, felt something else, a pull toward understanding what the runes meant. The bell arrived at their harbor just as a storm forecast warned of dangerous swells. The brothers didn't know it yet, but the symbols carved into that bronze would lead them into a mystery that stretched back 1,000 years, to a time when fishermen in these same waters used methods to read the weather that modern science had nearly forgotten. And the discovery would force them to choose between profit, legacy, and the dangerous truth hidden in the depths. Chapter 1. The Weight of Bronze. The bell sat on the wooden table in the harbor shack, still dripping seawater onto the floor. Jon had placed it there carefully, as if it might shatter, though bronze didn't break so easily. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from something he couldn't name. In 20 years of fishing these waters, he'd seen nets snag on wrecks before, but nothing like this. Nothing carved. The runes formed a pattern around the bell's circumference, each stroke deliberate and deep. Some were familiar, the standard Norse alphabet that appeared in sagas and old stones, but others were different, arranged in clusters that seemed almost mathematical. Sigurd ran his thumb across the surface, already calculating. Bronze that old, even corroded, had value. The pattern alone would intrigue collectors, museums perhaps. "We should contact someone," Eric said, his voice quiet but certain. He was the youngest by 5 years, and his brothers often ignored him, but he'd studied the old stories, read the sagas in the long winter nights. "This isn't just an artifact. Look at the arrangement. It's deliberate. It means something." "It means money," Sigurd replied, not unkindly. "We're behind on the boat's repairs. Winter's coming. This bell could mean we don't sell to the Danes or take loans from the city." Jon said nothing. He stared out the shack's small window toward the sea. The water was turning gray-green the way it did before storms. The forecast had warned of rough seas by evening. His grandfather had taught him to read the sky, the water, the behavior of birds. Old methods that most younger fishermen dismissed. But his grandfather had also spoken of methods even older, knowledge that some families kept, knowledge that had been lost. "We should bring someone in," Jon said finally. "Someone who studies these things, before we do anything else." That night, Eric made calls to the University of Iceland, to museums, to historians whose names he'd seen in books. By morning, a professor named Halldóra had agreed to visit. She'd sounded skeptical over the phone, but something in Eric's description, the pattern of the runes, the age of the bronze, the location where it was found, had interested her. They waited for her arrival through a day of increasing wind. The harbor groaned. Boats rocked in their moorings. The fishermen who passed the shack glanced at the bell with curiosity, but Jon kept it covered with canvas. Word traveled fast in small towns. He didn't want rival fishermen, salvage hunters, or worse, spreading rumors before they understood what they had. By the time Halldóra arrived, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and weathered hands that suggested she'd done more than academic work, the sea was already angry. She examined the bell for nearly an hour in silence, photographing it from every angle, tracing the runes with her fingers. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but layered with something that sounded like awe. "I've seen fragments like this," she said slowly. "References in medieval manuscripts, stories about bells used by ancient fishermen to predict weather patterns. The runes aren't just decoration. They're a system, a code. She looked up at John. Where exactly did you pull this up? John pointed toward the window, toward the gray water beyond the harbor. 3 kilometers out, on the shelf where we always fish. The depth there is about 40 meters. That's significant, Haldora said. That location, 40 meters deep. That's where an old Viking settlement is marked on archaeological surveys. Nothing confirmed, but there are references. If this bell came from there. She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. This wasn't just an old object. It was connected to something larger, something forgotten. Outside, the storm arrived. Wind hammered the shack. Rain came sideways. And for the first time since pulling the bell from the water, John understood that finding it had changed something. The 3 brothers stood in that small room with a historian and a bronze bell carved with runes, and above them the sky cracked with lightning. The bell, catching the flash of light, seemed to glow, not with magic but with the reflection of something ancient, something that had been waiting in the dark water for a very long time. Chapter 2. The Language of Storms. Haldora returned the next morning with equipment, a camera that captured minute details, rubbings of paper and charcoal, a leather journal already filled with notes. The storm had passed, leaving the sea flattened and exhausted. She worked methodically, mapping each rune, cross-referencing them against photographs on her laptop. The symbols here, she said, pointing to 3 runes clustered near the bell's base. These relate to pressure systems, not in the way we understand them now, but in observation. Wind direction, cloud formations, water temperature changes. Your ancestors noticed patterns. They documented them. This bell wasn't decoration. It was a record, a teaching tool. She looked at Eric. Fishermen would read it before going out. It would tell them what to expect. How? Sigurd asked skeptically. How can runes predict weather? They don't predict, Haldora corrected. They record what should warn you, a symbol for the kind of clouds that precede sudden swells, a marking for water that's too warm or too cold, another for wind patterns that shift to dangerous directions. If you knew the system, you could look at the sky and the water, match what you saw to the runes, and understand your risk. Eric leaned closer, his mind already spinning. So whoever carved this, they were teaching other fishermen, passing down knowledge. Exactly. And this bell. Haldora turned it carefully. This was probably mounted somewhere, on a post, in a community space, where fishermen could gather and study it before venturing out. Then how did it end up in the sea? John asked. Haldora's expression sobered. Storms destroy things. Wars destroy things. Maybe it was lost during a disaster. Maybe it was deliberately hidden. Or... She paused, studying the bell's surface. There are markings here that suggest damage. Not from the ocean, but deliberate damage. Scratches, intentional scraping. Someone tried to erase some of the runes. The implications hung in the room like fog. Sigurd's phone rang. He stepped outside to answer, and when he returned, his expression had shifted. That was Runar from the museum in Reykjavik. Word's already spreading about the bell. He's offering to buy it as is. No questions. 50,000 krona. Jon looked at Sigurd, then at Eric. In the harbor, the Hrafen needed work. The family had debt. 50,000 krona was real. It was survival. We're not selling yet, Eric said firmly. We haven't decided anything, Haldora added, though her voice suggested she hoped they would choose differently. But I need to know more. I need to take this bell to the university. I need to compare it with medieval manuscripts, with archaeological records from that settlement. If this system was real, if fishermen actually used this to stay alive in these waters, that's significant. That's history. And if someone wants to keep it hidden? John asked quietly. If the reason it's damaged is because someone wanted the knowledge lost? Haldora met his eyes. Then we're about to disturb something that someone went to great trouble to bury. Outside, the sea glittered under weak sunlight. In the distance, a fishing boat moved toward the horizon, and John found himself wondering if its captain carried the knowledge that the bell represented, or if that knowledge had been lost entirely. drowned in the same water that had just released the bronze bell after 1,000 years of silence. Chapter 3. Currents of doubt Halldóra took the bell to Reykjavik, promising to return within a week with preliminary findings. The brothers drove her to the airport, and as they returned to the harbor, Eric felt the weight of the decision pressing down. John was quiet, preoccupied with boat repairs and the declining fish stocks. Sigurd made phone calls to salvage dealers and private collectors, voices low, eyes sharp with the calculation of profit. By evening, Eric sat alone in the shack with his laptop researching. He found references to medieval manuscripts mentioning bells used by fishermen. He found archaeological surveys of the settlement where the bronze bell had been pulled from the water. He found stories, old family sagas that mentioned the knowledge of safe waters, passed down through generations of fisher families. But he also found warnings in old texts, references to forbidden knowledge that the church had tried to suppress, methods of reading weather that priests called pagan superstition. It occurred to him that the scratches Halldóra had found, the deliberately erased runes, might not be accidental damage. They might be evidence of deliberate erasure centuries old. His brothers came in around midnight bringing fish and beer. They ate in silence until Sigurd spoke. Runar called again. He's raised the offer to 70,000. Says there are private collectors interested. European museums. We wait for Halldóra, John said, but his voice wavered. We wait and lose the chance, Sigurd countered. Or we sell and solve our problems now. Eric spoke up. What if the bell shows us something valuable about the old knowledge? About how to read these waters better? That's worth more than money. No, it's not, Sigurd said flatly. Money is worth money. Everything else is a story. They argued into the night, the way brothers do, not with anger but with the weight of different beliefs pulling them apart. John listened more than he spoke, and Eric could see him wavering, see the exhaustion of debt and responsibility wearing him down. The next morning brought news. Runar had visited the harbor in person. He'd spoken to other fishermen and word of the bell had spread. Now, a salvage company from Denmark had expressed interest. A private collector from Germany had made inquiries. The bell suddenly had become valuable to many people, and no one knew exactly why that was. That's when John made the call to an old friend, a man named Gunnar who lived in the hills and kept the old traditions alive. Gunnar arrived that afternoon, a weathered man with eyes like granite, and he asked to see the bell. When Eric showed him photographs, Gunnar went very still. My grandfather had a bell like this, Gunnar said quietly. Or rather, a drawing of one. He told me it was stolen from our family during the priest's time when they wanted to erase the old ways. He said the knowledge in those runes could save lives, could tell a fisherman when to go out and when to stay home. He said it was worth more than gold because it kept men alive. Where is the drawing? Eric asked. Gunnar pulled out a worn leather journal from his bag. The sketch inside was crude but clear. The same pattern, the same arrangement of runes. In the margin, in old handwriting, words in Icelandic that translated to, "The bell that teaches the sea's language. Whoever holds it holds the power to keep fishermen alive or send them to their deaths." John stared at those words. Outside, the sea was calm, deceptively peaceful. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. The erasure Halldóra returned 4 days later, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. She'd brought printouts of manuscripts, photographs of ancient symbols, and more questions than answers. The bell, she explained, was part of a system that stretched back at least 900 years, possibly further. Medieval records mention it obliquely, she said, spreading documents across the table. References to the bronze teacher that fishermen consulted. There are accounts from the 1400s where the church explicitly tried to suppress knowledge of it. They called it witchcraft, weather magic. They wanted it destroyed. Did they find it? Eric asked. That's where it gets interesting, Halldóra said. The records stop. After 1487, there's no further mention of the bell. It vanishes from history. But look here. She pointed to a medieval sketch in one document. This shows the bell partially erased, runes deliberately scratched away. I think what happened is that someone, maybe a priest, maybe a family trying to protect it, damaged the bell deliberately to destroy its power. But they didn't destroy it completely. They threw it in the sea where it couldn't be found. Sigurd's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and stepped outside without a word. The damage we saw, Haldora continued, that happened before it was submerged. The weathering after that is consistent with deep water, cold salt water, 900 years of immersion. She pulled out her laptop and showed them her research. I've been studying the runes. I'm beginning to understand the system. It's brilliant, actually. Each rune represents a specific observable phenomenon. Water clarity indicating temperature change, cloud formations, wind patterns that correlate with pressure systems. A trained observer could read these patterns on the bell and match them to what they saw in nature. So it's not magical, Gunnar said. It wasn't a question. No, Haldora confirmed. It's ecological knowledge encoded in symbols, ancient weather science essentially. But to the church in the medieval period, anything they didn't understand was witchcraft. Sigurd returned, his expression closed. That was Runar. The Danish salvage company is prepared to offer 250,000 krona. They know about the bell's historical significance. They want exclusivity. The number hung in the air like a physical thing. 250,000. It would solve everything. The boat repairs, the debts, the pressure of survival. John and Eric exchanged a look. They both heard what Sigurd wasn't saying. We could be done with this. Be done with the weight of it. There's something else, Haldora said quietly. She pulled out a final document, a letter translated from Latin dated 1487. It detailed a meeting between a bishop and a keeper of the bronze knowledge. The keeper had claimed that the bell's knowledge could save lives, and that destroying it would be destroying the survival of entire communities. The bishop's response was clear. Such knowledge comes from darkness, and it will be eliminated. I think, Haldora said carefully, that someone in that community chose to protect the bell rather than let it be destroyed. They damaged it enough that its power would seem broken, then they cast it into the sea. They probably expected it to be lost forever. But it wasn't, Eric said. No. It survived, and now we have to decide what to do with it. Gunnar stood and walked to the window, looking out at the sea. My grandfather kept that drawing because he believed the knowledge mattered. He said losing it would mean losing a connection to who we were, to how our people survived these waters. Survival is present tense, Sigurd said, not unkindly. We need money now. Heritage doesn't fill a boat's fuel tank. It was true. John knew it was true. But he also knew something else. That once they sold the bell, they would never know what the runes truly taught. Never understand the knowledge their ancestors had considered worth protecting. That night, Eric dreamed of water pulling the bell down, of runes being erased one by one, of knowledge sinking into darkness, and he woke knowing that they had to understand the bell completely before any decision could be made. Chapter 5. The storm comes. Again. 3 days passed. Haldora worked continuously, deciphering the system. Gunnar provided context from his family's traditions. And slowly, a picture emerged. The runes weren't random wisdom, but a specific predictive system based on observations that fishermen in cold northern waters would recognize immediately. The bell taught that when the water turned a certain gray-green, currents were shifting dangerously. When birds behaved a particular way, storms were coming within hours. When certain clouds formed in specific patterns and wind came from the northeast rather than the north, waves would reach dangerous heights. 100 small observations, encoded, distributed on the bronze surface, so that fishermen could gather around and learn. It was, Haldora explained, an early weather prediction system. Imperfect but effective. It had probably saved hundreds of lives. This knowledge, she said to the brothers, should be preserved, studied, shared. It's part of your cultural heritage, and more than that, It's a template for how ancient peoples adapted to their environment. It changes how we understand medieval Icelandic society. But Sigurd remained unconvinced. And how does that help our debt? How does heritage keep fishermen from drowning when the boat fails? The question hung unanswered because it was, fundamentally, unanswerable. Then the forecast changed. A storm was building, unusual for late November. A massive depression moving north from the Atlantic, predicted to hit within 24 hours. Dangerous seas, winds exceeding 80 kilometers per hour, potential for flooding in coastal areas. The fishing fleet received warnings to stay in harbor. That evening, Eric brought the bell back out, no longer in photographs and rubbings, but the actual bronze object. He sat with it in the shack, studying the runes by lamplight. John found him there around midnight. "Teach me the system," John said. It wasn't a request. For 3 hours, Eric explained what Halldóra had deciphered. The rune formations that indicated dangerous pressure changes. The markings that suggested when water temperature had shifted. The symbols that warned of wind patterns that preceded sudden violent swells. Then John did something unexpected. He stood and took the bell outside where the wind was already rising. He studied the sky with the eyes of a man who'd read these waters for 20 years, and he matched what he saw to the runes on the bell. When he came back inside, his face was pale. "It's accurate," he whispered. "I can see it now. The pattern of clouds, that rune there. The way the wind's coming, that one. The water's color, that one. It's all there, written 1,000 years ago, and it describes exactly what I'm seeing right now, predicting exactly what's about to happen." "Then why are you afraid?" Eric asked. "Because," John said slowly, "if this knowledge is real, if it works, then someone died to protect it. Someone deliberately damaged it and threw it into the sea because they believed it was too important to lose and too dangerous to let others find. And now we're deciding whether to sell it for money." The brothers sat in silence as the wind outside grew louder, as the harbor lights swung wildly, as the Hrafn rocked in her moorings. At 3 a.m., Sigurd finally came to find them. He'd been on the phone with Runar with the Danish company with collectors, but he didn't speak about offers. Instead, he just asked, "Is Halldóra right? Does it really work?" "Yes," John said. "It really works." Sigurd sat down heavily. "Then we can't sell it." Eric turned to him in surprise. "If it works," Sigurd continued, his voice rough, "if it's real knowledge that keeps fishermen alive, then selling it would mean that some other family somewhere wouldn't have access to it when they needed it. And I don't think I can live with that." The storm arrived at dawn, exactly as the runes had suggested. The brothers watched from the harbor as the sea became something wild and uncontrollable, as waves crashed against the breakwater with force that seemed impossible. Fishing boats rocked at their moorings. Warnings blared across the radio. And not a single boat was at sea, because the forecast had warned them. But 1,000 years ago, without the forecast, without satellite imagery, a fisherman would have known to stay home, because they would have read the bell, understood the runes, recognized that the morning's signs spelled danger. The knowledge, preserved so long, had just proven its worth. Chapter 6. The Weight of Legacy. When the storm passed, the brothers made their decision. They contacted Halldóra, Gunnar, and the University of Iceland. The bell would be donated to the university, preserved, studied, and eventually displayed so that the knowledge could be shared. Runar was told that the item was no longer for sale. The Danish company's offer was declined. There was, Sigurd admitted later, a moment where the fear of poverty almost won. But in the end, John had reminded them of something their grandfather had said. Some things you don't measure in money because they're worth more than survival. They're worth the survival of who we are. The donation came with conditions. The university would collaborate with Gunnar and his family to document the traditional knowledge that had been preserved through generations, the sketches and stories that had kept the bell's purpose alive even when the bell itself was lost. Halldóra would lead the research, and the findings would be published, made available to anyone, especially to the fishing communities of Iceland. Within a year, the system had been fully decoded. The runes taught practical weather science that, while superseded by modern meteorology, demonstrated sophisticated ecological observation. Universities around the world requested the research. The bell became part of Iceland's cultural heritage, displayed carefully to preserve the ancient bronze. But the greatest value revealed itself gradually. Fishing communities began to understand their ancestors differently. Schools taught the story of the bell as an example of how knowledge could survive persecution, how symbols could preserve wisdom when words were no longer trusted. Young people learned the runes not as a practical weather tool but as a connection to something deeper, a reminder that their culture had always been about reading the natural world, understanding the sea, respecting the power of observation and adaptation. And on the Raffen, which John and Sigurd eventually repaired using a combination of small grants, community support, and a return to sustainable fishing practices, the bell story was told to everyone who stepped aboard. Fishermen from other communities came to hear it. The knowledge, which had been erased once by priests who feared it, had been preserved once in the deep ocean, and now, ironically, it was being preserved again in the telling, in the memory, in the cultural identity of people who understood that some inheritance couldn't be measured in price. Eric eventually became a researcher himself, working alongside Haldora to document other examples of ancient ecological knowledge that communities had preserved. The bell had opened a door, and through that door lay the understanding that wisdom wasn't always written in books or carried by institutions. Sometimes it lived in the ocean itself, in the observations of people who had no choice but to read the natural world or die. On clear nights, fishermen still sailed from the harbor at Reykjavik. Some carried GPS and modern weather systems, but some also carried in their memory the knowledge of the bell, the runes that had survived 1,000 years, the system their ancestors had created to live safely in dangerous waters. They didn't need the bronze anymore, but they needed what it represented, the unbroken chain of human knowledge, the refusal to let what matters most sink into darkness. The bell itself remained in the university's climate-controlled collection, safe from the salt water and time that had preserved and corroded it in equal measure. And though it no longer served as a teaching tool for fishermen, it served something perhaps more important. It was a physical reminder that knowledge, properly protected, could survive centuries, and that sometimes the real treasure isn't what you find, but what you learn about yourself in the act of searching. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.